So, hello as we start up again. I'm Steve Gendel, the Food Allergen Coordinator at the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you and update the presentation from the last webinar on food allergens and allergen control. My goals for this talk are to describe food allergy, to review what is being done to help protect allergic consumers through food labeling and allergen control during food manufacturing, and to talk about allergen-related food recalls. So first, food allergy is an immune-mediated intolerance to food that occurs when someone produces antibodies that react to specific food proteins. It is a major public health issue worldwide, and it's estimated to affect about 6 to 8% of children and 1 to 2% of adults in the U.S. Significantly, food allergic reactions are estimated to cause up to 29,000 emergency room visits and up to 125 to 150 deaths each year in the U.S. Allergic reactions, the signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction, can vary widely from person to person, both in the organ systems that are affected and the severity of the responses. So responses can involve the skin, the gastrointestinal system, the respiratory system, or the vascular system. But most significantly, severe reactions will involve multiple organ systems and can lead to anaphylaxis, shock, and even to death. Food allergy represents a very unique regulatory challenge because an allergic response is a response to a food or a food component that is actually nutritious and desirable for most of the population, rather than a contaminant or an additive that's external to a food. Secondly, as I mentioned, both the sensitivity of the individuals and the severity of a reaction can vary widely in the population, and in fact can even vary over time for the same individual. And, most importantly, no cure exists for food allergy. So protecting allergic consumers involves actions by the consumer and their families, by public health agencies, and by the food industry. Allergic consumers need to practice strict avoidance, which means that they and their families must be assiduous readers of food labels. Public health agencies need to work with the food industry to assure that food labels declare all of the food allergens that are intended to be present in the food, and that the products are made to avoid the presence of unintended allergens. With that background in mind, we can turn to talking about food allergen labeling and control. In the U.S., the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which has the acronym FALCPA, defined how allergens should be declared on food labels so that consumers can get the information that they need. FALCPA amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to define the term major food allergen and to establish labeling requirements for these major food allergens. So before we go on and I talk about FALCPA, let's take a few seconds out to do a quiz. So looking at this list, which of these foods is not a major food allergen as defined by FALCPA in the U.S.? I'll give you a few seconds to get your answers in. Okay, so now that we've had some answers, let's look at the list of major food allergens. So this is the definition of major food allergen from FALCPA. These are milk, egg, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, wheat, peanuts, and soybean. Foods that are or that contain ingredients that contain protein from one of these major food allergens must declare that allergen on the label using the common name of that food. For example, a food that contains ovalbumin must include the word egg on the label. In that way, allergic consumers can easily identify foods with problematic ingredients. For those major food allergens that are food groups, such as the tree nuts or fish, the name of the specific type or species within that group must be used on the label. For example, a food containing pecans must say pecan rather than just say tree nuts. So, from the quiz, the correct answers are that sesame and tomatoes are not major food allergens in the U.S. And I was pleased to say that a very large percentage of the people knew about tomatoes. Interestingly, sesame, although it's not a major food allergen in the U.S., is a priority allergen subject to labeling requirements in the European Union and in Canada. And this points out that it's important to remember that food safety rules and regulations are not always the same around the world. So FOLCPA defined two formats that can be used to declare a major food allergen on a food label, either within the ingredient list or in a separate contain statement that appears after the ingredient list. In either case, the common name of the food source is used. If a contain statement is used, all of the major food allergens that are present in the food must be listed in that statement, regardless of whether they are also in the ingredient list. It's also important to remember that all of the other normal labeling requirements and regulations still apply to ingredients in foods, regardless of which format is used, or for that matter, whether there are any major food allergens present or not. FOLCPA did not eliminate any other labeling requirements, it just added the requirements related to food allergens. It's also important to note that FOLCPA does not address advisory labeling, such as the use of a may contain statement. FDA expects labels using these statements to be truthful and for industry to not use advisory labeling as a substitute for good manufacturing practices. So turning now to food allergen control, in addition to ensuring that all the allergens that are intended to be present in foods as ingredients are properly declared on the label, it's equally important to ensure that no unintended allergens are present in a food. This is accomplished by using preventive controls and good manufacturing practices. The Food Safety Modernization Act that was passed several years ago is changing many aspects of how FDA regulates food production. As part of this change, FDA has issued a proposed rule that describes preventive controls and modernizes the GMPs. Both of these include steps to prevent allergen cross-contact during food manufacturing. Among the things that are included in this proposed rule is the explicit identification of allergens as hazards that need to be considered in a hazard analysis, and the need for an allergen control plan as part of the food safety plan when that's appropriate. The proposed rule was issued for comment, and FDA is considering each and every one of all the comments that were received in preparing the final version of the rule. Next, I'd like to take some time to look at some information on food allergen recalls. Each year, a number of food products are recalled because they contain undeclared allergens. These products represent a risk for allergic consumers because they don't provide consumers with the information needed for successful avoidance. To get an idea of what is behind the high number of allergen recalls, we did a detailed analysis of information in the FDA's recall database. So first, we looked at the number of allergen recalls that occurred each year since 2007. This year was chosen as the start point because it's the first full calendar year when FOLCPA was in effect. As you can see, the number of allergen recalls has been increasing steadily over time. The last bar for 2013 is an estimate based on preliminary data and may go up as the final analysis is completed. Importantly, it's turned out that for the last couple of years, undeclared food allergens have been the leading cause of recalls for FDA-regulated foods. Next, we looked at the allergens and the foods that were most often involved in these recalls. Bakery products were recalled far more often than the other types of foods, and milk was the allergen most often involved in a food allergen recall. Interestingly, milk, wheat, and egg are the allergens most often involved in food recalls in Canada, the European Union, and in the U.S. for products regulated by the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service. Bakery, snack foods, and candy are the food types most often involved in allergen recalls in Canada and the European Union. The most interesting part of our analysis came when we looked at the underlying problems that created the needs for the recalls. The most common problem was the use of the wrong package or the wrong label on a food package. The second most common problem was failure to use the common name of the food allergen. And the third most common problem was failure to declare an allergen that was known to be present in an ingredient. The reason that this is interesting is that these problems are not technologically complex. That is, they are easy for producers to prevent by using careful controls. We have also seen several emerging issues leading to allergen recalls. The number of recalls related to these problems is not large, but they may be signals of developing problems. I think that the most significant of these emerging problems is the increased use of computerized systems to print labels on demand, or even to print them directly on food packages. As with our desktop computer systems, in many cases it appears to be easy to use outdated files, to make typos when updating files, or simply to click on the wrong file when loading information. All these mistakes could lead to consumers seeing incorrect allergen information. So finally, it's time to ask, what does the future hold over the next couple of years? First, and most importantly, the agency will be finalizing the preventive controls rule and preparing a guidance document on allergen controls. Based on this rule, the guidance document, and our experience with allergen recalls, FDA will be doing a lot of outreach and education to help food manufacturers develop or improve allergen control programs. And that's all. I'll take any questions that have come in.
Thank you, Steve. We do have some questions for you. One question that you might, a shorter question is, can you grow out of a food allergy, such as peanuts?
It's true, some people do. It depends upon the allergen and the individual. A fairly high proportion of children who develop milk and egg allergy when they're very young as infants do outgrow those allergies. On the other hand, very few people with peanut allergy or tree nut allergy outgrow them. Interestingly, as children outgrow their childhood allergies, there is an increase in adults who acquire allergies to crustacean shellfish.
There's another question, thank you. There's another question. How would you declare an allergen for a food such as goat or sheep cheese, ravioli, or a goat or sheep protein? One cannot say it contains milk because milk refers to milk that comes from a cow. So how would you declare it for goat or sheep?
So that's correct. Technically, by our rules, milk means bovine milk. But as I mentioned, all of our other labeling regulations still apply. So if you use goat's milk or sheep milk as an ingredient for making a food product, you do have to declare that ingredient by those terms. So people who are sensitive to those particular allergens would have that information available on the label. It just wouldn't be in the same place as other allergen information.
And there's one more question. And that one is, do you see regulatory oversight of statements that appear on the label, such as may contain or similar statements, in such a way that they are better defined for consumers who are allergic?
That's a great question. And I guess the answer to that is we are aware of the fact that a lot of people aren't sure what those statements mean. and that there's a lot of variability in the industry about which statements they use and when they use them. And we are looking very carefully at the issue, trying to figure out what we can do that would provide the information that allergic consumers need without unduly restricting the industry and making sure that those statements are meaningful. So this is an ongoing area that we're actively working on at this time.
Here's another question. When do you expect preventive controls to be finalized?
Well, I'm going to sort of give the same kind of answer that Casey did to her last question, which is that's something which is being done in a different office. We, as you may be aware, reproposed some parts of the preventive control rule, just opened up a docket on that. They'll be open for a short period of time. The agency does have a deadline that they've agreed to for issuing these rules as part of a court proceeding, but overall the process is a very long and complex one, and I don't know how long it will actually take to complete.
And there's yet another question. Will the 8 list of food allergens be expanded to include other foods? The list of 8, yes.
Again, that's a question that we get a lot, and it's also a very interesting legal issue because the definition of the major food allergen in that list of 8 was actually written directly into the law when Congress passed it. So we are not able to amend that list directly ourselves. There are other provisions in the law which would allow us to take other steps for labeling foods if we felt that the public health risk was significant in that regard. And that's something we're looking into for a couple of other possible foods.
And our final question has to do with recalls. The questioner thinks that FDA needs to define recalls and how a person can follow those instructions. So I know that you had that in your presentation. Perhaps you could reiterate what you said.
So, well, actually, I'm not sure. If you're talking about what constitutes a recall?
For allergens.
For allergens.
Yes.
So, what I would suggest is to go to our website. There's a link to some pages there where we post information on every recall for an FDA-regulated product. There's links that go to areas that have explanations of the meaning of the different levels of the recalls. And you can, in fact, sign up for email alerts that you can get for every kind of FDA food recall and subsets like for allergen recalls.
Steve, I want to thank you so much for that wonderful and informative presentation. We will now take a 15-minute break and resume at 1:45.